The wagon train didn't slow down. Clara Whitman stood in the mud, rain hammering her face, her 6-month-old son screaming against her chest, and watched the last lantern disappear into the darkness. They'd left her. All of them. Her husband had ridden out that morning to hunt and never came back. Now the storm was closing in. The broken wheel lay useless in the dirt, and she was alone on the Montana frontier with nothing but a baby, a canvas shelter that wouldn't last the night, and the terrible understanding that abandonment doesn't always come with warning. Sometimes it just comes. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you're settling in for this journey, hit that like button. You're about to witness what happens when survival becomes the only choice left. The rain came down in sheets. Clara Whitman pressed her son tighter against her chest, trying to shield him with her shawl, but the wool was already soaked through. Samuel's cries had weakened to whimpers, and that terrified her more than his screaming had. 6 months old and already learning that the world didn't answer back. She stood beside the broken wagon wheel, watching the distant lights of the train fade into nothing. They'd stopped for barely 20 minutes, long enough for the wagon master to assess the damage, long enough for the other families to exchange glances, long enough for Mrs. Patterson to say what everyone else was thinking. "We can't wait. Storm's getting worse." Clara had begged. She'd promised she could fix it, promised she'd catch up, promised her husband would return any minute with fresh game and help. But Thomas hadn't come back. He'd left at dawn, rifle over his shoulder, telling her he'd seen deer tracks. That was 8 hours ago. "Your husband made his choice, Mrs. Whitman." The wagon master's voice had been flat, final. "I got 30 families depending on me to get them through this pass before snow. I'm sorry. Sorry didn't keep you warm. Sorry didn't fix wagon wheels. Sorry didn't explain why Thomas's horse was gone, why his saddlebags were gone, why the small leather pouch where they kept their traveling money was also gone." Clara had stood in the mud and watched them leave. Every single wagon, every family she'd traveled with for 3 months. The Harrisons with their 4 daughters, the Johnsons with their matching oxen, even the Reverend Cooper, who'd spoken so eloquently about Christian charity every Sunday, had simply tipped his hat and clicked his tongue at his team. Now she was alone. The canvas shelter she'd managed to rig between the wagon and a scraggly pine tree flapped violently in the wind. It wouldn't hold. The storm was strengthening. She could feel it in the way the air pressure changed, in the way the rain shifted from vertical to horizontal, in the way the temperature dropped with each passing minute. Montana in September. Beautiful during the day, deadly at night. Samuel whimpered again, and Clara ducked under the canvas, kneeling in the mud. She'd lined the wagon bed with every blanket they owned, creating a nest for him, but the blankets were getting damp now, the moisture creeping in through the wagon boards. "Shh, sweetheart. Mama's here." Her voice cracked. "Mama's right here." She laid him down gently, checking his clothes. Damp, but not soaked. His face was red from crying, his little fists clenched. She opened her bodice and tried to nurse him, but he turned away, too upset to latch. Or maybe he could sense her fear. Babies knew things, people said. Knew when their mothers were frightened. Clara closed her eyes and tried to think. The wheel was broken beyond her ability to fix. The hub had cracked clean through when they'd hit that hidden rock. Thomas had been driving too fast, not paying attention, and she'd felt the sickening crunch, felt the wagon lurch. He'd cursed, jumped down, assessed the damage in 30 seconds. "I'll hunt while they decide what to do," he'd said. "Might as well make use of the delay." He'd kissed her forehead, quick, perfunctory, and ridden off. That was the last time she'd seen him. Now, sitting in the mud with her baby fussing beside her, Clara let herself think the thought she'd been pushing away all afternoon. Thomas had been different these last few weeks. Distant. He'd started sleeping away from their bedroll, claiming he wanted to give her and Samuel more room. He'd stopped talking about their plans for the homestead in Oregon, and twice she'd caught him counting money late at night, money she didn't know they had. "No," she spoke aloud, her voice barely audible over the storm. "No, he wouldn't." But the evidence was damning. His horse, gone. His rifle, gone. His good coat, his father's watch, the money pouch, all gone. And Clara, with a broken wagon wheel and an infant left behind. Abandoned. The word tasted like ash. Thunder cracked overhead, so close she felt it in her chest. Samuel started screaming again, and Clara picked him up, rocking him desperately. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. We're going to be—" But she couldn't finish the lie. They weren't going to be okay. The temperature was dropping fast now. She could see her breath. Her fingers were numb. Samuel's cries were getting weaker again, that terrible weak sound that meant cold and hunger and exhaustion all mixed together. The canvas ripped free from one corner with a violent snap, exposing them to the full force of the rain. Clara scrambled to secure it, but the rope was slick, and her hands weren't working right anymore. She got it tied, barely, but she knew it wouldn't hold through the night. Night. It was getting dark already, the storm clouds blocking what little daylight remained. In another hour, she wouldn't be able to see her own hands, and the night would bring worse cold, possibly snow. She had no fire. Everything was too wet. She had no shelter that would last. She had no food except what little hardtack remained in her bag, and that was already soggy. Clara sank down in the mud, holding Samuel against her, and felt something inside her crack. This was how people died on the frontier. Not from Indian attacks or bear maulings or dramatic shootouts. They died quietly, in the mud, forgotten by people who had their own survival to worry about. They died because a wagon wheel broke at the wrong time, because a husband decided freedom was worth more than family, because a storm came in fast and brutal and unforgiving. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Samuel. "I'm so sorry, baby." His cries had stopped. He lay against her chest, breathing fast and shallow, his little body shivering. Clara wrapped the shawl tighter, but she had nothing left to give him. No warmth, no food, no hope. She closed her eyes. The rain hammered down, and then, through the roar of the storm, she heard it. Hoofbeats. Clara's eyes snapped open. She listened, hardly daring to breathe. Yes, hoofbeats, coming fast, coming closer. Relief flooded through her so intensely she felt dizzy. Thomas had come back. He'd gotten lost in the storm, or delayed somehow, but he'd come back. He hadn't abandoned them. She'd been wrong, she'd doubted him, but he was here now. The horse that emerged from the rain wasn't Thomas's bay gelding. It was a big roan mare, dark with water, her sides heaving. And the man on her back wasn't Thomas. He was taller, broader in the shoulders, wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low and a canvas duster that shed water in streams. He pulled the horse to a stop 20 feet away and sat there for a moment, looking at her broken wagon, her pathetic shelter, her mud-soaked figure holding a baby. Clara's relief curdled into fear. Out here, alone, vulnerable. This man could do anything, take what little she had, take worse. And she had no way to stop him. The stranger swung down from his horse in one smooth motion. He was maybe 35, with a weathered face and eyes that looked gray in the dim light. He approached slowly, hands visible, like he was gentling a spooked animal. "Ma'am." His voice was deep, rough from disuse. "You hurt?" Clara shook her head, unable to speak. He glanced at the broken wheel, at the disappearing wagon tracks already filling with water, at Samuel in her arms. His jaw tightened. "Where's your husband?" "He went hunting." The words came out automatically, the lies she'd been telling herself all day. "This morning. He should be back soon." The stranger's eyes met hers, and she saw he knew. Knew about the missing horse, the missing saddlebags, the missing man who wasn't coming back. But he didn't call her on it. "This storm's going to kill you." He stated it flatly, no emotion. "Both of you. You understand that?" Clara nodded slowly. "My ranch is 2 miles north." He gestured vaguely through the rain. "You can wait out the storm there, decide what to do after." "I can't leave the wagon." Even as she said it, she knew how ridiculous it sounded. "My things, your things won't matter if you're dead." He was already moving, pulling items from the wagon bed with quick efficiency. "What do you need? Quick now." Clara's mind felt sluggish, frozen. The blankets, Samuel's clothes, my bag. There, the brown one." He grabbed them, rolling everything into a tight bundle and lashing it to his saddle. Then he turned back to her. "Can you ride?" Yes, but Samuel." "You'll hold him." "I'll hold you. Horse can carry all 3. He stepped closer, and Clara instinctively drew back. He stopped immediately, hands up. "Ma'am, I know you got no reason to trust me, But that baby's lips are turning blue and you're shaking so hard you can barely stand. We go now, or we don't go at all. Clara looked down at Samuel. His face was pale except for 2 spots of red on his cheeks, and his breathing was too fast. The shivering had stopped, and she knew that was worse. Hypothermia. She'd seen it before, on the trail. She looked back at the stranger, at his worn duster and mud-splattered boots, at the rifle on his saddle and the hard set of his jaw, at his hands, rough and scarred from work, at his eyes, which held neither pity nor judgment, just a flat assessment of reality. "Okay," she whispered. He nodded once and lifted her onto the horse like she weighed nothing. The saddle was warm from his body, and the horse stood steady despite the storm. He handed Samuel up to her, then swung up behind them both, his arms coming around her to grasp the reins. "Hold tight." The horse moved forward into the storm. Clara had never felt so small. The man's chest was solid behind her, blocking some of the wind, and his arms created a shelter of sorts around her and Samuel. But the rain still drove into her face, and the darkness was nearly complete now. She had no idea where they were going, no idea if this stranger was her salvation or her doom. "What's your name?" she had to shout over the wind. "Caleb Hart." "I'm Clara Whitman." He didn't respond, just kept the horse moving at a steady pace through the mud and rain. Clara felt Samuel's breathing against her chest, still too fast, but steady. She tucked the blanket tighter around him, using her body to shield him from the worst of the weather. Time lost meaning. There was only the rhythm of the horse's gait, the drum of rain, the ache in Clara's arms from holding Samuel, the strange intimacy of being held by a man she didn't know. Minutes or hours could have passed. She couldn't tell. Then, finally, she saw light. A building emerged from the darkness, low and solid, with golden lamplight showing through shuttered windows. Not a grand house, but sturdy, real. As they approached, Claire could make out a barn, a corral, other outbuildings barely visible through the rain. Caleb guided the horse straight to the barn, ducking through the wide doors. Inside it was blessedly dry and relatively warm, the air heavy with the smell of hay and animals. He dismounted first, then lifted Clara and Samuel down carefully. "There's a house." He pointed to a door at the back of the barn. "It connects through the mudroom. Get inside, get dry. I'll tend the horse." Clara hesitated, Samuel heavy in her aching arms. "Go on," Caleb said, not unkindly. "Fire's banked, but still going. Stove's in the kitchen. You know how to work a stove?" "Yes." "Then get that baby warm. I'll be in directly." He turned away, already loosening the saddle cinch, and Clara stumbled toward the door. It opened into a small mudroom lined with pegs and boots, then into the house proper. The kitchen was simple but clean, a cast-iron stove radiating blessed heat, a wooden table with 2 chairs, open shelves lined with dishes and supplies. Clara went straight to the stove, opening the door to add wood from the nearby box. The flames caught quickly, and heat began to fill the room. She laid Samuel on the table and stripped his wet clothes with shaking hands. His skin was cold, his lips still that terrible blue-white. She wrapped him in the driest blanket from the bundle Caleb had saved, then pulled a chair close to the stove and held him near the warmth. "Come on, baby. Come on, Samuel. Warm up for Mama." Slowly, gradually, color began to return to his face. His breathing eased. His eyes opened, finding her face, and he made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a question. "That's it," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "That's my boy. You're okay. You're going to be okay." She was still sitting there, rocking and crying and warming her son, when Caleb came in through the mudroom. He'd taken off his duster and hat, revealing dark hair plastered to his head, and a face marked by sun and wind and years of hard living. He glanced at her, at Samuel, and nodded once. "Baby looks better." "Yes." Clara's voice was hoarse. "Thank you. I can't. Thank you." He moved to the stove, picking up a kettle and filling it from a pump at the sink. "You need to get warm too. Dry clothes in the bedroom, down the hall, first door. They'll be too big, but better than what you're wearing." He set the kettle on the stove. "I'll make coffee." Clara looked down at herself. She was soaked through, still shivering, her dress caked with mud. But the thought of leaving Samuel, even for a moment, felt impossible. "I'll watch him." Caleb's voice was gruff. "He'll be fine by the fire. Go." It was the firmness that convinced her, that same flat assessment of reality. She was no good to Samuel if she got sick. She needed to get warm and dry. The bedroom was small and spare, a bed with a simple quilt, a dresser, a single window shuttered against the storm. Clara found a flannel shirt and canvas pants that smelled of soap and sun. She stripped off her wet things, dried herself with a towel from the dresser, and pulled on the borrowed clothes. They were absurdly large, but dry and soft and warm. When she returned to the kitchen, Caleb had Samuel in his arms, still wrapped in the blanket, held carefully near the stove's warmth. The sight stopped Clara in the doorway, this hard-eyed stranger holding her baby with unexpected gentleness. He looked up, saw her watching, and held Samuel out. "Coffee's ready." Clara took her son and settled back into the chair. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee, black and strong, and set one beside her. Then he pulled the other chair to the far side of the table and sat down, keeping distance between them. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside while the kitchen stayed warm and dry and safe. Samuel finally latched onto Nurse, and Clara felt some of the terror leave her body. "The wagon train left you," Caleb said it quietly, staring into his coffee. "Not a question." "Yes." "And your husband?" Clara's throat tightened. "I don't know where he is." Caleb nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "What were you headed toward?" "Oregon. We had plans for a homestead, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Thomas said—" She stopped, swallowed. "He said we'd build a good life." "Oregon's still 6 weeks out this time of year, maybe more with a baby." "I know." Another long silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. "You can stay here tonight," Caleb finally said. "Storm should break by morning, then we'll figure out what comes next." "I can't impose—" "You already are," he said it matter-of-factly. "Questions not whether you're imposing. Questions what happens after the storm." Clara looked down at Samuel, now sleeping peacefully against her chest. What did happen after the storm? She had no wagon, no husband, no money, no way to reach Oregon even if she wanted to. She had a 6-month-old baby and nothing else. "I'll send word to Fort Benson," Caleb continued. "See if anyone knows about your husband. See what happened to your wagon train. But that'll take time, few days at least." "You've already done so much." "I found you dying in a storm." His gray eyes met hers, steady and uncompromising. "Wasn't going to ride past that. But now you're here, and that means we deal with what's real, not what's polite." Clara found herself nodding. There was something almost comforting in his bluntness. No false promises, no empty reassurances, just reality. "What's real," she said slowly, "is that my husband abandoned us, took everything we had and ran. I have no way to support myself or my son, and I have no idea what to do next." Caleb took a long drink of his coffee. "That's a start. Knowing what's true. Doesn't help much. Helps more than lying to yourself." He stood, refilling his cup. "You should sleep. Take the bedroom. I'll bunk in the barn." "I can't take your bed." "Yes, you can." He was already moving toward the mudroom. "Baby needs proper rest, and so do you. We'll talk more when you're not half frozen and exhausted." He was right, Clara realized. She was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open, the warmth and safety of the kitchen finally letting her body acknowledge what it had been through. "Mr. Hart," she said as he reached the door. He turned back. "Why did you help us?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, his hand on the doorframe. "Because someone had to." Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone with her sleeping son in a stranger's kitchen while the storm raged outside. She sat there for a while longer, drinking the bitter coffee, feeling warmth seep back into her bones. The house was solid around her, rough pine walls, a roof that didn't leak, a stove that held steady heat. Through the window she could see nothing but darkness and rain. Her wagon was out there somewhere, already being buried by mud and storm. Her old life, such as it was, disappearing under Montana weather. Tomorrow she would have to face questions she couldn't answer. Tomorrow she would have to figure out how to survive as a woman alone with a baby in frontier country that had no patience for weakness. But tonight, She was warm. Samuel was safe. And a stranger named Caleb Hart had ridden into a killing storm because someone had to. Clara carried Samuel to the bedroom, laying him carefully in the center of the bed and building a nest of blankets around him. She lay down beside him, one hand on his small chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The storm howled outside, but inside, for the first time since Thomas had ridden away that morning, Clara Whitman closed her eyes and slept. She dreamed of wagon wheels breaking in endless mud, of lanterns disappearing into darkness, of standing alone while the world moved on without her. But when she woke in the deep night to Samuel's cry, the room was still warm, the roof still held, and through the small gap in the shutters she could see that the rain had finally stopped. Dawn was coming, and with it, whatever came next. The first full day of light came slow and gray, the sun struggling through clouds that hadn't quite finished with the sky. Clara woke to Samuel's fussing and the unfamiliar weight of quilts that smelled like pine soap and wood smoke. For a moment she didn't remember where she was, and then it all came back. The storm, the abandonment, the stranger on the roan mare. She sat up carefully, Samuel already rooting against her. The house was quiet except for the faint sounds of someone moving in the kitchen. Clara changed Samuel's diaper using the last clean cloth she had, then wrapped him in the blanket and carried him toward the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Caleb stood at the stove, his back to her, working a cast-iron skillet with practiced efficiency. He'd changed into dry clothes, dark canvas pants and a faded blue work shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hair was still damp from washing, and in the morning light she could see the silver threading through the dark. He glanced over his shoulder. "Coffee's hot. Bacon's almost done." "You didn't have to eat anyway." He cracked eggs into the pan, 3 of them, the whites sizzling against the iron. "Baby sleep?" "Yes, better than I expected." Clara poured herself coffee, juggling Samuel on her hip. The kitchen looked different in daylight, still simple but well kept. Clean dishes on the shelves, a bunch of dried herbs hanging by the window, everything in its place. Caleb plated the food and set it on the table, then poured his own coffee and sat down across from her. He ate methodically, not speaking, his attention on his plate. Clara tried to eat one-handed, Samuel growing heavier by the minute. "I can hold him." Caleb's voice was quiet. Clara hesitated, then passed Samuel across the table. Caleb took him with the same careful competence he'd shown the night before, settling the baby against his chest while he continued eating. Samuel stared up at him with wide eyes, not crying, just watching this stranger's weathered face. "You have children?" Clara asked, then immediately regretted the question. Too personal, too soon. "No." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "Had a wife once. She died before we got that far." "I'm sorry." He shrugged, a minimal movement. "Was 10 years ago. Long time." They finished eating in silence. When Clara reached for the plates to wash them, Caleb shook his head. "Leave them. I need to check something first." He stood, still holding Samuel, and walked to the window. His expression darkened. "Storm did more damage than I thought." Clara joined him at the window. In the gray morning light, she could see the ranch spread out before them. The barn, a chicken coop, a small corral, and beyond that, rolling grassland stretching toward distant mountains. But closer in, she could see what had him concerned. Part of the corral fence was down, rails scattered like matchsticks. The chicken coop's door hung crooked on broken hinges. "I need to fix that before nightfall." Caleb handed Samuel back to her. "Chickens are probably scattered to hell, and if that fence doesn't get mended, I'll lose my horses." "Can I help?" He looked at her steadily. "You know anything about mending fence?" "I can learn, and I can't just sit here while you work." Clara shifted Samuel to her other hip. "I won't be a burden, Mr. Hart. If I'm staying even one more day, I need to earn it." Something shifted in his expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. "Call me Caleb, and if you're serious, there's work. But the baby, I can wear him. I have a sling in my bag." Caleb nodded slowly. "All right then. Get him settled and meet me at the barn. Wear those work clothes. Dress won't do you any good out here." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing firmly behind him. Clara fashioned the sling from a length of cloth, settling Samuel against her chest where he could nurse when needed and sleep when he wanted. The borrowed pants and shirt felt strange after months of wearing dresses, but practical. She pulled on her own boots. At least they'd dried overnight, and headed out. The air was cold and clean, washed pure by the storm. Mud sucked at her boots as she crossed the yard to the barn, where Caleb was already loading tools into a wheelbarrow: hammers, nails, a saw, coils of wire. "You'll help with the chickens first," he said without preamble. Most of them should have roosted in the coop despite the broken door, but some probably scattered. Look under the porch, in the barn, anywhere they might have hid from the storm. Get them back in the coop and I'll fix the door after the fence. It wasn't a question, so Clara didn't treat it like one. She just nodded and started looking. The first chicken she found was huddled behind a rain barrel, wet and miserable. Clara approached slowly, remembering helping her grandmother with chickens as a child. The bird squawked but didn't run, and Clara managed to scoop her up and carry her to the coop. 3 more were roosting in the barn rafters. 2 she found under the porch, just as Caleb had predicted. By the time she'd rounded up 8 chickens, Samuel had fallen asleep against her chest, and her arms were scratched from reaching into tight spaces. She found Caleb at the corral, already knee-deep in mud, wrestling a fallen post back into position. "Found 8, she called. "Should there be more?" "Had 12 before the storm," he grunted, leveraging the post. "4's not bad. They might come back on their own, or they're coyote food by now. Either way, nothing to be done about it." Clara watched him work for a moment. The way he tested the post's stability, the efficient movement of his hands as he packed mud and rocks around the base. He worked like a man who'd done this 1,000 times. No wasted motion. "What can I do?" "Hand me rails as I call for them, and keep count. I need to know how many we're short so I can cut new ones." They worked in silence for 2 hours. Caleb would position a post, pack it solid, then call for rails. Clara would drag them over, often struggling with the weight, and he'd lift them into place and nail them secure. Samuel slept through most of it, waking once to nurse and then drifting off again. The sun broke through the clouds around mid-morning, warming Clara's back as she worked. Her arms ached, her hands were blistered, and mud had soaked through her pants to her knees, but there was something steadying about the work, something real. "You're short 4 rails," she said when they'd finished the section, "and 1 post is cracked. It'll need replacing soon." Caleb looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "You counted?" "You asked me to." He almost smiled. Almost. "Come on. I'll show you where the lumber's stored. We'll cut new rails this afternoon." They walked back to the barn, Clara's legs heavy with exhaustion. Inside, Caleb showed her the corner where he kept seasoned wood, pine and oak, already cut to various lengths. "Rails need to be 7 feet, he said, pulling out a measuring tape and marking a board. "I'll cut you, Sand. Otherwise they'll give the horses splinters, and we'll have infected legs to deal with." "You do all this yourself? The ranch, the animals, the maintenance?" "Who else would do it?" Caleb positioned the board on sawhorses. "Had a hired man last year, but he moved on. Most do. Ranch this small doesn't pay enough to keep help." "How small?" 140 acres, 30 head of cattle, 6 horses, the chickens, garden in summer, hay crop if the rain's good. He started sawing, the blade biting through wood with rhythmic precision. "Enough to live on, not enough to get rich." Clara picked up the sandpaper he'd handed her and started working on a finished rail. "But it's yours." "It's mine." He didn't look up from his work. "Homesteaded it 11 years ago. Built the house the first year, barn the second. Lost half my cattle to winter the 3rd year, learned from it the 4th. It's not much, but it's paid for and it's mine." They worked until the sun was high, cutting and sanding 4 new rails. Samuel woke again, fussing from hunger and a wet diaper. Clara changed him using another precious clean cloth. She was down to her last 2 now, and nursed him while sitting on a hay bale. Caleb brought her water from the pump without being asked, then disappeared into the back of the barn. He returned with a wooden crate full of cloth. "Old shirts, mostly," he said gruffly. "Some past mending. You can cut them up for the baby if you need." Clara's throat tightened. "That's very kind." "It's practical. Can't have you running out of diapers." He set the crate beside her. "There's scissors in the kitchen drawer, left of the sink." He walked away before she could thank him again, back to his work. That afternoon, while Caleb installed the new rails, Clara washed diapers in a large basin by the pump and cut up 3 old shirts into usable squares. It was domestic work, The kind she'd done her whole married life, but it felt different here. Essential rather than expected. A contribution rather than an obligation. When the sun started sinking toward the mountains, Caleb fixed the chicken coop door and checked the animals. Clara made supper from what she found in his pantry. Salt pork, beans, cornbread from scratch. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling. They ate at the kitchen table again, Samuel asleep in a nest of blankets on Caleb's bed. The silence between them had shifted from awkward to almost comfortable, born from a full day of shared work. "I should go into town tomorrow," Caleb finally said. "Need to send that telegram to Fort Benson. Ask about your wagon train, your husband. See what information comes back." Clara's stomach clenched. "How far is town?" "Ridgeway, about 8 miles. He pushed food around his plate. "You and the baby should stay here. Road's still going to be a mess from the storm." "What will you tell them? About me?" "The truth, that I found you abandoned in a storm, that you're waiting for word about your husband." His gray eyes met hers. "Unless there's something else you want me to say." "No, the truth is fine." Clara took a breath. "How long before we hear back?" "Week, maybe. Depends on whether they can track the wagon train, whether anyone knows anything about your husband." He paused. "You thought about what you'll do if the news is bad?" "Every minute since they left me." Clara's voice came out steadier than she felt. "But I don't have answers yet." Caleb nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He left for town before dawn the next morning, riding the big roan mare. Clara woke to find him gone and coffee already made. A note on the table in rough handwriting. "Back by supper. Don't touch the bull in the south pasture." She smiled despite herself, then spent the day making herself useful. She found Caleb's laundry piled in a corner of the mudroom and washed it along with her own clothes and Samuel's diapers. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, organized the pantry, mended a rip in one of the blankets. Samuel seemed content to watch from his nest of quilts, making small sounds and waving his fists at dust motes in the sunlight. By afternoon, Clara had worked her way through most of the obvious chores. She was considering tackling the windows when she heard horses, multiple horses, coming fast. Her heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed Samuel and moved to the window, peering out cautiously. 3 riders were approaching the house. Not Caleb. These horses were different, and the men wore range clothes stained with travel. They reined up in the yard, looking around with the casual assessment of men used to evaluating property. The oldest one, maybe 50 with a grizzled beard, dismounted first. "Hello, the house!" Clara's hand shook as she opened the door, keeping it mostly closed with her body blocking the gap. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, then dropped to Samuel in her arms. "We're looking for Caleb Hart. This his place?" "He's not here right now." "You his wife?" The man's tone was friendly enough, but his companions had spread out slightly, flanking her field of vision. "I'm a guest." Clara lifted her chin. "Mr. Hart will be back this evening." "A guest." The man exchanged glances with the others. "That right? You got a name, ma'am?" "Mrs. Whitman." "Well, Mrs. Whitman, my name's Jim Tolliver. I ranch about 15 miles west of here. These are my sons, Ben and Charlie." He gestured to the younger men. "We're tracking some cattle that went missing after the storm. Wondered if Caleb might have seen anything." It sounded reasonable, but something in the way they'd positioned themselves, the way the sons kept their hands near their pistols, made Clara's instincts scream. "I'm sorry, I haven't seen any cattle. Just arrived myself 2 days ago." "From where?" "This from one of the sons. Ben, maybe." "That's not your concern." Clara kept her voice level. Jim Tolliver's friendly expression didn't waver, but his eyes went hard. "Now, ma'am, we're just trying to be neighborly. Asking questions, no need to be unfriendly about it." "I've answered your question. Mr. Hart isn't here, and I haven't seen your cattle. Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave." "Awful protective of a place that's not yours." The other son, Charlie, had a mean edge to his voice. "You sure Hart knows you're here? Pretty young woman, all alone in a man's house. Might give folks the wrong idea." Clara's face flushed, but she held her ground. "Mr. Hart saved my life and my son's life. I'm waiting here for news about my husband. That's all you need to know." "Your husband know where you are?" Jim Tolliver took a step closer. Clara started to close the door. You need to leave. Now. Hold on. Tolliver put his hand on the door, stopping it. We're just talking. And then another voice cut through the tension, cold and absolutely steady. Take your hand off that door. Everyone turned. Caleb sat on his horse at the edge of the yard, rifle across his saddle, pointed in their general direction. Clara hadn't heard him approach. None of them had. Jim Tolliver removed his hand slowly. Caleb, didn't expect you back so soon. Clearly, Caleb didn't move, didn't lower the rifle. What are you doing at my house, Jim? Just asking questions. Lost some cattle in the storm. Thought you might have seen them. Haven't. Now you've asked, you can go. Your guest here was just telling us about her husband. Jim's tone had gone sly. Seems like an interesting situation. Seems like none of your business. Caleb's voice was flat. Mrs. Whitman is under my protection. That's all you need to know. Now get off my land. The sons looked at their father, hands still near their guns. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jim Tolliver smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Sure, Caleb. No harm meant. Just being neighborly. He swung back into his saddle. But you might want to think about appearances. Woman alone, baby with no father around. People talk. Let them. Caleb's rifle hadn't moved an inch. Leave. The Tollivers rode out slowly, taking their time, making it clear they were leaving by choice, not force. Caleb didn't move until they were out of sight over the rise. Only then did he lower the rifle and dismount. Clara realized she was shaking. Samuel was crying, picking up on her fear, and she tried to soothe him with trembling hands. Caleb walked to the porch, his face unreadable. You all right? Yes, they just asked questions, but something about them. Jim Tolliver's been trying to buy this place for 5 years. Caleb's jaw was tight. Offers about half what it's worth, acts like he's doing me a favor. Last year he tried to claim water rights that would have cut off my creek. Lost that fight with the land office, but he's been looking for an angle ever since. You think he'll cause trouble? I think Jim Tolliver causes trouble the way other men breathe. Caleb opened the door wider. But he won't come back here. Not after that. Clara stepped inside, her legs suddenly weak. Caleb followed, closing the door firmly and setting the rifle by the entrance. I'm sorry, Clara said. I shouldn't have opened the door. You did fine. Didn't tell them anything they could use, kept yourself safe. He moved to the stove, stoking the fire with short, controlled movements. But he was right about one thing. People will talk. Clara's chest tightened. I can leave. If my being here causes you problems, where would you go? Caleb turned to face her, his expression almost harsh. You've got no money, no husband, no wagon. Winter's coming in 6 weeks. Where exactly do you think you'd go? I don't know. Clara's voice broke. But I won't be the reason you lose your ranch. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then his shoulders dropped slightly. You're not going to lose me my ranch. Jim Tolliver's been trying that for years without success. Having a woman and baby here doesn't change anything. But what he said about appearances? He's trying to scare you, make you think you're a liability. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. Don't let him. Clara sank into the other chair, bouncing Samuel gently. Did you send the telegram? Yes. Asked about the wagon train, asked about your husband. Telegraph operator knew something. I could see it in his face. But he said he needed to check records, send some messages of his own. Said to come back in 3 days. He knew something about Thomas? Maybe. Or maybe about the wagon train. Hard to say. Caleb rubbed his face tiredly. But we'll know soon enough. 3 days. Clara looked down at Samuel, who had finally stopped crying and was starting to nurse. 3 days before she learned the truth, she already knew in her bones that Thomas had abandoned them deliberately, that he'd planned it, that everything she'd built her life on was a lie. I meant what I said about pulling my weight, she said quietly. However long I'm here, I won't be dead weight. Never thought you would be. Caleb stood and moved to the stove. You made supper? Beans and cornbread, nothing fancy. Fancy doesn't fill a stomach. He lifted the lid on the pot, and Clara saw his shoulders relax slightly at the sight of hot food waiting. Thank you. They ate together as the sun set, talking little, the tension from the Tollivers' visit slowly easing. After the dishes were washed and Samuel was asleep, Clara stood at the window looking out at the darkening mountains. "Caleb?" She spoke without turning. "Why are you doing this? Really?" She heard him shift behind her. "Told you already. Someone had to." "That's not a reason. That's an excuse." Clara turned to face him. "You could have taken us to town, left us at the church, or with the sheriff. But instead you brought us here, to your home. Why?" Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My wife died in a storm. Different kind of storm, cholera, swept through the valley one summer. I was away buying cattle, didn't even know she was sick until I came home and found her buried. Town folks did that, buried her, said some words. But not one of them had helped her when she was dying. Not one had sat with her, or held her hand, or made sure she wasn't alone." His voice was rough, the words clearly costing him. "They said it was too dangerous, too contagious. Said they had their own families to think about. And maybe that's true. Maybe they were right to protect themselves, but Sarah died alone, and I wasn't there, and nobody cared enough to risk anything for her." He looked at Clara directly. "So when I saw you in that storm with your baby, I thought about Sarah, and I thought about all the reasons I could ride past, the danger, the inconvenience, the complications, all the good practical reasons. And then I thought about Sarah dying alone. And I stopped the horse." Clara's throat was tight. "I'm sorry. About your wife. Long time ago." But his eyes said different. "Point is, you're here now. We'll figure out the rest as it comes." That night, Clara lay in Caleb's bed with Samuel beside her and listened to the house settle around them. Somewhere beyond the walls, Caleb was sleeping in the barn, giving up his own comfort without complaint. The Tollivers were out there too, probably already spreading rumors about the woman staying at Caleb Hart's ranch. 3 days until she learned what had happened to Thomas. 3 days until she had to face the full truth of her abandonment. But tonight, in this moment, she was warm and fed and safe. Samuel was breathing steadily beside her, healthy and content. And a man named Caleb Hart, carrying his own grief like stones in his pockets, had chosen to help them for no other reason than because someone had to. Clara closed her eyes and let herself rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The present was all she could manage, and for now, the present was enough. The 3 days passed in a rhythm of work and waiting. Clara fell into the pattern of ranch life without discussion, up before dawn to start coffee, feeding chickens while Caleb tended the horses, cooking meals that stretched his supplies to feed 3 instead of 1. Samuel seemed to thrive in the mountain air, his cheeks growing rounder, his cries stronger. On the second morning, Clara found Caleb repairing a saddle in the barn, his hands working leather with the same steady competence he brought to everything. "I need to learn to ride," she said without preamble. He looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to survive out here, I need to know how. A woman who can't ride is useless in this country." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "This afternoon, after the heat breaks." He chose a gentle mare named Rosie, patient and steady, and spent 2 hours teaching Clara the basics: how to mount, how to sit, how to use her legs and not just the reins. Samuel watched from a sling on Caleb's chest, making small sounds that might have been encouragement. "You're gripping too tight with your knees," Caleb said, walking beside the horse. "Let yourself move with her. She's not going to throw you." Clara forced herself to relax and immediately felt the difference. The mare's gait smoothed out, and for the first time she felt like she was riding rather than just clinging. "Better." Caleb's voice held approval. "Try a trot now. Just to the fence and back." By the time the sun was setting, Clara's legs were shaking and her backside was sore, but she could mount and dismount on her own and had managed a slow trot without falling. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The third morning arrived gray and cold, frost touching the grass for the first time. Caleb came into the kitchen earlier than usual, already dressed for town. "I'll be back before dark," he said, pouring coffee. "Probably have news by then." Clara's stomach nodded. "Should I come with you?" "Road's still rough. Better if you stay." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever I hear, you'll know it all. I won't keep things from you." "I know." And somehow she did know. Caleb might be hard and blunt, but he wasn't a liar. She watched him ride out, then forced herself to work. She baked bread, scrubbed the mudroom floor, mended 2 more of Caleb's shirts. But her mind was elsewhere, running through possibilities. Thomas dead in an accident, Thomas arrested for theft, Thomas remarried already to some other desperate woman. Each scenario seemed equally likely and equally devastating. The afternoon stretched interminably. Clara nursed Samuel, changed him, walked with him around the yard, sang songs her own mother had sung. But the waiting pressed on her chest like a weight. Finally, as the sun touched the mountains, she heard hoofbeats. Caleb dismounted slowly, his face unreadable. He tied the mare to the porch rail and climbed the steps, holding a folded paper in his hand. Clara met him at the door, Samuel in her arms. "Tell me." Caleb handed her the paper, a telegram, the words brief and brutal. "Thomas Whitman deceased. Stop shot, attempting robbery, Fort Laramie. Stop. Body identified by stolen money, pouch. Stop. Wagon train reached Oregon, September 28th. Stop. No inquiries made regarding Clara Whitman or infant. Stop." The words blurred. Clara read them again, then a third time, trying to make them mean something different, but they stayed the same. Thomas was dead. He'd stolen their money, abandoned his family, and died trying to rob someone else. And the wagon train had reached Oregon without once asking if she'd survived. "Clara," Caleb's voice was gentle. "Sit down." She realized she was swaying. Caleb took Samuel from her arms and guided her to a chair, then pressed a cup of water into her shaking hands. "Drink." She drank mechanically, tasting nothing. Her mind felt distant, disconnected. Thomas was dead. She was a widow. Samuel had no father, would never have a father, would grow up knowing his father had chosen theft and flight over his own son. "The telegram came from Fort Laramie," Caleb said quietly. "Sheriff there sent it after he got my inquiry. Said Thomas was shot by a shopkeeper he tried to rob. Died before the doctor arrived. They found your money pouch on him, recognized it from the description I gave." "How much?" Clara's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "What? How much money did he steal from us? How much was I worth to him?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. $73. Clara laughed, a bitter sound. $73. He traded his wife and son for $73. Clara. And the wagon train. She looked up at him, feeling something cold and hard settling in her chest. "They reached Oregon. They're safe and settled, and they never once asked if we were alive. Not once." "No," Caleb admitted. "They didn't." Clara set the cup down carefully, her hands steadier now. The initial shock was fading, replaced by something clearer. Anger, maybe. Or just clarity. "So I'm alone," she said. "Completely alone. No husband, no family, no community. Just me and Samuel and whatever charity we can find." "You're not alone." Caleb's voice was firm. "You're here." "For how long?" "I can't stay on your charity forever, Caleb. That's not fair to you." "Fair's got nothing to do with it." He shifted Samuel to his other arm, the baby already dozing. "But you're right that we need to figure something more permanent. You can't just exist in limbo." Clara took a shaky breath. "What are my options? Really?" Caleb set Samuel carefully in his basket, then pulled out the other chair and sat down. "You could go back east, take the train, find family if you have any." "I don't. My parents are dead, no siblings. Thomas had family in Ohio, but they never approved of our marriage. They won't want me or Samuel." "All right, you could stay in Ridgeway, try to find work. Maybe as a cook or a laundress." "With a baby? Who would hire me?" Clara shook her head. "And I'd need somewhere to live. Someone to watch Samuel while I worked. I have no money for that." "There's the church. They might help." "Might?" Clara's voice was flat. "The same way the wagon train might have come back for me. The same way Thomas might have chosen differently. I'm done betting on might, Caleb." He nodded slowly. "Then there's one other option." "What?" "Ridgeway needs a school teacher. The last one married a minor and moved to Virginia City 3 months ago. The position's been empty since." Clara stared at him. "A teacher? You can read and write. You speak well. You know arithmetic." Caleb leaned forward. "The school board's desperate. Winter's coming and they've got 20 children with no teacher. They might not care about the baby if you can prove you're capable. But I've never taught before. Have you been to school? Through 8th grade. My father believed in education for girls. Then you know more than half the parents in this valley. Caleb's gray eyes were steady. It's not a perfect solution. Pays not much, maybe $30 a month plus a room in town. But it's yours, earned by your own work, not charity. Clara's mind raced. A teacher, a real position, with real pay, independence, or the start of it anyway. But the obstacles seemed overwhelming. They'll never hire me. An unmarried woman with a baby, no references, no experience. You're a widow, Caleb corrected. Your husband died serving his country. Clara's eyes widened. That's a lie. Is it? Thomas died at Fort Laramie. That's a military fort. The telegram doesn't specify how he died, just that he did. Caleb's voice was matter-of-fact. People will assume what they want to assume. Let them assume something that helps you instead of hurts you. You want me to lie to the school board? I want you to survive. Caleb stood and moved to the stove, pouring coffee with deliberate movements. Out here, Clara, truth is luxury. Survival is necessity. Your husband abandoned you and died a thief. That's truth. But that truth will destroy any chance you have of building a life. So you tell a different truth. You're a widow with a baby, educated and capable, willing to work hard. Let them fill in the rest themselves. Clara felt something shift inside her, a letting go of the woman she'd been, the one who'd believed in rules and propriety and honest dealing. That woman had been left in the mud beside a broken wagon wheel. What about references? They'll want references. I'll give you one. Ranch owner, established in the valley for 10 years. I'll tell them you're honest, hardworking, and educated. He turned to face her. It's not a lie. You're all those things. You barely know me. I know you didn't fall apart when your world ended. I know you work without complaining, and you learn fast. I know you love your son enough to fight for him. Caleb's voice softened slightly. That's more than most people show in a month, let alone 3 days. Clara looked down at her hands, work roughened now from fence mending and washing and all the small labors of frontier life. 3 days ago, she'd been Clara Whitman, abandoned wife, helpless victim. Now Caleb was offering her a chance to be someone else, someone who made her own way. When would I start? School board meets next Monday. I'll take you into town, introduce you to Frank Morrison. He runs the mercantile and heads the board. You'll need to show them you can manage a classroom, probably teach a demonstration lesson. With Samuel? Bring him. Let them see you can handle both. Show them strength, not apology. Caleb set his cup down. And Clara, don't tell them about Thomas. Not the truth. Just that he died and you're doing your best to build a life for your son. That's all they need to know. That night, Clara lay awake long after Samuel had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman she was choosing to become. A widow, yes, that much was true. But not the widow of a thief and an abandoner. The widow of a man lost to the frontier's harsh realities. A woman alone but not broken. Capable, educated, determined to provide for her child. It felt like putting on someone else's clothes. But then her own clothes were ruined and mud-stained and useless now anyway. The next 5 days, Caleb taught her everything he could think of that might help. How to project her voice so it carried across a room. How to stand with authority despite her small frame. How to handle disruption and disrespect without losing composure. He even brought out his wife's old books. Readers and arithmetic primers and a worn copy of McGuffey's eclectic spelling book, and had Clara practice teaching him as though he were a stubborn student. You're too gentle, he said after one session. These are frontier children. Half of them work ranches harder than grown men back east. They'll respect strength, not sweetness. Clara tried again, this time putting steel in her voice when student Caleb deliberately gave a wrong answer. That's incorrect. Try again and think carefully this time. Better, Caleb nodded. Don't let them walk over you. They'll test you hard, especially the older boys. You give an inch, you'll lose them completely. On Sunday, Caleb rode into town alone and came back with fabric, dark blue cotton, enough for a dress. You'll need something proper for the interview, he said gruffly, handing her the bundle. Something that looks like a teacher, not a ranch hand. Claire's throat tightened. The fabric was good quality, not cheap. Caleb, this is too much. It's practical. Can you sew? Yes. Then make yourself a teacher's dress. Consider it an investment. She worked on it every evening after chores, her fingers remembering the stitches her mother had taught her years ago. The dress took shape slowly, high-necked, long-sleeved, severe and proper. The dress of a woman who meant business. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. Clara dressed carefully in the new blue dress, pinning her hair back in a tight bun. She looked at herself in the small mirror above Caleb's dresser and barely recognized the woman staring back. Stern, capable, composed. Not at all the frightened girl who'd stood beside a broken wagon wheel 2 weeks ago. Samuel fussed as she dressed him in his cleanest clothes, but he settled once she had him in the sling against her chest. Caleb was waiting by the horses, wearing what must have been his town clothes, clean pants, a pressed shirt, a vest that had seen better days but was still respectable. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but I'm going anyway." The ride to Ridgeway took 2 hours. Clara had improved enough in her riding that she managed the journey on Rosie without embarrassing herself, though her legs were shaking by the time they reached the edge of town. Ridgeway was bigger than she'd expected. Maybe 300 people, with a main street of false-fronted buildings, a church with a white steeple, a schoolhouse painted red. Real civilization, or the frontier's version of it anyway. People stared as they rode down the main street. Clara kept her eyes forward, her back straight, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Beside her, Caleb sat his horse like he owned the territory, his mere presence seeming to deflect questions. They tied their horses outside Morrison's Mercantile, a 2-story building that dominated the center of town. Inside, the store smelled of coffee and leather and new cloth. A man stood behind the counter, late 50s, balding, with sharp eyes that assessed them immediately. "Caleb Hart." The man's voice was neutral. "Been a while since you came to town." "Frank?" Caleb nodded. "Got business with the school board. This is Mrs. Clara Whitman. She's interested in the teaching position." Frank Morrison's eyes moved to Clara, then down to Samuel in the sling, then back up. His expression didn't change, but she saw the calculations happening behind his eyes. "That's so." He came around the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. "We've been looking for a teacher, that's true. But I'll be honest, ma'am, we were expecting someone with experience." "I have education," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. 8 years of formal schooling plus extensive reading. I can teach reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. I'm willing to work hard and I need the position." "And the baby?" "My son. His father died at Fort Laramie. I'm doing my best to provide for him." She saw Morrison's expression shift slightly. Not quite sympathy, but acknowledgement. A widow was respectable. A widow was deserving of help. "Fort Laramie." Morrison's tone changed. "My condolences, Mrs. Whitman. That's a hard loss." "Thank you." Clara met his eyes directly. "But I'm not looking for sympathy, Mr. Morrison. I'm looking for work, fair pay for fair labor. I can teach your children, and I can do it well." Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The board meets at 2 o'clock at the schoolhouse. Can you be there?" "Yes." "Bring materials for a demonstration lesson. Something appropriate for mixed ages. We've got students from 5 to 15. He paused. "And Mrs. Whitman? The board will ask hard questions. They need to know you can handle frontier children, not just recite lessons." "I understand." Outside, Clara let out a breath she'd been holding. Caleb touched her elbow briefly. "You did well. Now we prepare." They spent the next 3 hours at the public house, where Caleb bought them lunch while Clara sketched out a lesson plan on paper he'd brought. She decided on a reading lesson that could work for multiple ages. The younger children would practice letters while the older ones worked on comprehension and vocabulary. Simple, but it would show she could manage a diverse classroom. At 1:45, they walked to the schoolhouse. It was a single room with wooden benches, a pot-bellied stove, and a teacher's desk at the front. 5 men waited inside, clearly the school board. Frank Morrison made introductions. A rancher named Webb, a lawyer named Sutton, the minister, Reverend Hayes, and a farmer named Kowalski. "Mrs. Whitman," Morrison gestured to the front of the room. "We've discussed your situation. Before we go further, we have questions. Clara moved to stand by the teacher's desk, Samuel warm against her chest. Of course. You're a widow. This from Sutton, the lawyer. How long ago did your husband pass? 2 weeks? Claire kept her voice level. He was traveling with our wagon train when he died. I was left with nothing but my son and the few possessions I could carry. And you came here how? Webb, the rancher, had skeptical eyes. Mr. Hart found me stranded after a storm. He offered shelter until I could determine my next steps. Clara looked at each man in turn. I'm not asking for charity, gentlemen. I'm asking for an opportunity to work, to earn my own way and provide for my child. The pay is $30 monthly, Morrison said, plus a room above the mercantile, small but private. You'd be responsible for teaching 5 days a week, managing the classroom, and keeping attendance records. That's acceptable. The children can be difficult, Reverend Hayes said quietly. Many work full days on ranches and come to school tired and resistant. The older boys especially can be challenging for a woman teacher. I'm not afraid of hard work or difficult students. Clara shifted Samuel slightly. But I won't tolerate disrespect or disruption. I'll teach with kindness, but also with firmness. These children deserve an education, and I intend to give them one. Kowalski, who hadn't spoken yet, leaned forward. What happens if the baby cries during lessons? I'll manage it. I can teach while nursing if necessary, and if Samuel needs attention that disrupts class, I'll handle it quickly and return to instruction. My son won't prevent me from doing this job well. The men exchanged glances. Finally, Morrison stood. Give us the demonstration lesson. Show us what you can do. Clara had them sit on the student benches, and for the next 20 minutes she taught as though they were children. She wrote letters on the slate board, asked questions, corrected imaginary mistakes with patience but authority. She incorporated movement to keep attention, used praise strategically, and when student Webb deliberately acted up, she shut him down with a look and a firm redirect that made the other men hide smiles. When she finished, the room was quiet. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman, Morrison said. We'll discuss and send word to you within the week. With respect, Mr. Morrison, I need an answer today. Clara kept her voice calm, but didn't back down. I'm staying at Mr. Hart's ranch currently, but that's a temporary situation. If you're not hiring me, I need to know so I can pursue other options. It was a bluff. She had no other options, but she said it with enough confidence that it sounded like simple pragmatism. Morrison's eyebrows rose. That's direct? I can't afford not to be. The men stepped outside to confer. Clara stood by the teacher's desk, Samuel starting to fuss now, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd done everything she could. The rest was up to them. When they returned, Morrison was holding a key. The position is yours, Mrs. Whitman. Classes start next Monday. I'll show you the room now and we'll settle details tomorrow. He handed her the key. Welcome to Ridgeway. Clara's knees went weak with relief, but she kept her composure. Thank you, gentlemen. I won't disappoint you. Outside, Caleb was waiting by the horses. One look at her face and he nodded, something like pride flickering in his eyes. You got it. I got it. Clara felt giddy and terrified in equal measure. I start Monday. Good. He untied the horses. Let's see this room of yours. Make sure it's habitable. The room above the mercantile was tiny, barely large enough for a bed, a chair, and a small dresser. But it had a window that looked out on the mountains, a small stove for heat, and it was hers, earned by her own capability, not given out of pity. Clara stood in the center of the room, holding Samuel, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not quite hope. She was too practical for that yet. But possibility. The chance to build something from nothing, to make a life where she chose the terms. It's perfect, she whispered. Caleb stood in the doorway, too large for the small space. You'll need things. Bed, blankets, dishes. I can bring some from the ranch until you get settled. Caleb, Clara turned to face him. You've done so much already, more than anyone had a right to expect. I can't keep taking. You're not taking, I'm offering. His voice was gruff. And before you argue, think about what you'd do in my position. If you had the means to help someone get their feet under them, wouldn't you? Clara thought about the woman she'd been 2 weeks ago, standing in the mud watching the wagon train disappear. Thought about the woman she'd decided to become. Harder, more practical, willing to take what she needed to survive. That woman knew better than to refuse help when it was offered honestly. "Yes," she said finally, "I would. Thank you." They rode back to the ranch in the fading light, and for the first time since the storm, Clara let herself imagine a future. She'd teach the children of Ridgeway, save her wages, raise Samuel to be strong and capable. She'd build a life piece by piece, independent and earned. It wouldn't be the life she'd planned when she married Thomas, but maybe it would be better, more honest anyway. That night, she helped Caleb pack items she'd need for town: a spare blanket, dishes, coffee pot, the small things that made a space livable. They worked in comfortable silence, and Clara realized how much had changed in 2 short weeks. She'd learned to trust this quiet man, learned to value his blunt honesty and steady competence. "I'll move to town Friday," she said, folding the blanket carefully. "Give myself the weekend to settle before classes start." "Makes sense." Caleb set a cast iron pan in the pile. "I'll drive you in the wagon, help you get everything up those stairs." "You don't have to." "Clara." He looked at her steadily. "I know I don't have to, but I'm going to anyway. Stop fighting every kindness like it's an insult." She felt her face heat. "I just don't want to be a burden." "You're not. You're—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "You remind me that there's still some decency left in this territory, that helping people matters. So let me help. For my sake, if not yours." Clara nodded, throat tight. "All right, for your sake." Friday came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Clara packed her few possessions while Samuel napped, trying not to think too hard about leaving. The ranch had become a haven, Caleb's quiet presence a comfort she hadn't expected to find. The drive to town was quiet, the wagon creaking under its light load. When they reached the mercantile, Caleb carried everything up the narrow stairs while Clara settled Samuel in his basket. By late afternoon, the tiny room looked almost livable. Bed made, dishes on the shelf, stove ready for morning coffee. Caleb stood in the doorway one last time, hat in his hands. "You need anything, you send word. Don't hesitate." "I won't." And Caleb— Clara crossed the small space and took his hand briefly. "Thank you for everything, for stopping in the storm, for giving me a chance to be more than a victim." His hand was warm and calloused around hers. "You were never just a victim. You're a fighter. Don't forget that." Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs, and Clara was alone with Samuel in their new life. She stood at the window and watched Caleb's wagon disappear down the street, then turned to face her tiny kingdom. 2 weeks ago, she'd had nothing. Now she had a room, a job, a future she was building with her own hands. It wasn't the life she'd imagined. But as she lit the small stove and started coffee, Samuel cooing from his basket, Clara thought maybe it was better. This life no one could take from her. This life she'd earned in mud and work and honest effort. And for the first time since the storm, she felt something close to peace. The first morning, Clara woke before dawn to Samuel's cry and realized she had no idea what she was doing. She'd convinced the school board she could teach their children, but standing in the cold darkness of her tiny room, she felt the full weight of the lie. She wasn't a teacher. She was a widow with a baby, playing a role she barely understood. But Samuel needed feeding, and the stove needed lighting, and there was no time for doubt. So Clara nursed her son, made coffee on the temperamental little stove, and dressed in the severe blue dress that made her look older than her 23 years. By the time the sun touched the mountains, she was walking toward the schoolhouse with Samuel in his sling and a knot of fear in her stomach. The schoolhouse was empty and cold. Clara set about building a fire in the pot-bellied stove, then arranged the benches in rows and wrote the day's date on the slate board in careful script. Her hands shook slightly, but the familiar ritual of preparation steadied her. This was just work. She could do work. The first student arrived at 7:30, a small girl, maybe 6 years old, with blonde braids and suspicious eyes. "You're the new teacher?" The girl looked Clara up and down. "You don't look like a teacher." "I am, though. What's your name?" "Emma Kowalski. My pa's on the school board." "I remember." "Hello, Emma." Clara gestured to the benches. "Choose your seat. We'll begin when everyone arrives." More children trickled in over the next half hour. Clara counted them as they entered, noting ages and attitudes. The younger ones were curious and shy. settling into seats without fuss. But the older students, 3 boys who looked 14 or 15, entered last with deliberate swagger, taking seats in the back row and watching Clara with open skepticism. "Good morning," Clara said when the clock struck 8. "My name is Mrs. Whitman, and I'll be teaching you this year. Let's begin with introductions. Starting from the front, tell me your name and your age." She learned their names quickly, 18 students total, ranging from 5-year-old Johnny Webb to 15-year-old Marcus Tolliver, who she recognized with a sinking feeling as Jim Tolliver's son. He had his father's mean eyes and his father's smirk. "All right," Clara moved to the slate board. "We'll start each day with penmanship practice. Younger students will copy letters, older students will work on composition. Let's begin." The first hour went smoothly. The children bent over their slates, and Samuel dozed against Clara's chest while she moved between rows, correcting grip and posture. But during the arithmetic lesson, trouble started. "This is baby work," Marcus announced loudly. "My pa says you don't know nothing about teaching." Clara stopped mid-sentence and turned to face him. The room went silent. "Your father is entitled to his opinion," she said calmly. "But in this classroom, you'll show respect or you'll leave. Which will it be?" Marcus grinned, enjoying the attention. "What if I don't want to do either?" "Then you'll stand in the corner until you decide." Clara pointed to the front corner of the room. "Now." "You can't make me." Clara walked to his desk and stood directly in front of him, close enough that he had to look up to meet her eyes. "You're right. I can't make you, but I can send a note to your father explaining why you've been expelled from school. I imagine he'll have opinions about that too." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Calculation, then uncertainty. He clearly hadn't expected her to call his bluff. "Or," Clara continued, her voice dropping lower so only he could hear, "you can stand in the corner for 10 minutes, return to your seat, and we can continue like civilized people. Your choice, Marcus." The silence stretched. Then Marcus shoved back his chair and stalked to the corner, his face red. The other students watched with wide eyes, and Clara returned to the front of the room as though nothing had happened. "As I was saying, when multiplying 2-digit numbers, we begin with the ones place." Marcus stood in the corner for exactly 10 minutes, then returned to his seat without a word. He didn't cause trouble again that day, but Clara could feel his resentment simmering. She'd won the first battle, but the war wasn't over. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern. The younger children adored her, eager to please and quick to learn. The middle students were respectful and diligent, but the 3 older boys, Marcus, his friend Jake Sutton, and a ranch hand's son named Cole, tested her constantly. Talking during lessons, giving deliberately wrong answers, making crude jokes just loud enough for her to hear. Clara handled each incident with firm consistency. She never raised her voice, never showed anger, just enforced consequences. Stand in the corner, write lines, stay after class. The boys seemed frustrated that they couldn't provoke her into losing control. By Friday afternoon, Clara was exhausted. Teaching was harder than any ranch work she'd done. The constant vigilance, the need to manage 18 different minds at once, the pressure of knowing that any show of weakness would lose her the classroom entirely. And through it all, Samuel needed feeding and changing and attention, though he'd been remarkably good about sleeping during lessons. She was cleaning the slate board after dismissal when Frank Morrison appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Whitman, how was your first week?" Clara set down the eraser. "Challenging, but manageable. The students are learning." "I heard about the trouble with Marcus Tolliver." Morrison's expression was unreadable. "His father came to see me yesterday." Clara's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice level. "What did he say?" "That you're too harsh. That his son doesn't respond well to discipline. That maybe a woman teacher isn't suitable for frontier children, after all." Morrison paused. "I told him that his son needs to learn respect, and if he can't manage it in your classroom, he can learn it at home instead." Relief flooded through Clara. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Jim Tolliver's not done making trouble. He never is. But you handled that situation right. The other parents are satisfied, and that's what matters." Morrison tipped his hat. "Keep doing what you're doing, Mrs. Whitman. And if Marcus gives you real problems, you let me know." That evening, Clara sat in her tiny room nursing Samuel and feeling the weight of the week settle into her bones. She'd survived. Barely, but she'd survived. The teaching itself was rewarding. Seeing young Emma Kowalski sound out her first full sentence, watching 10-year-old Robert Webb solve a division problem he'd struggled with all week. But the constant battle with the older boys, the awareness that one serious mistake could cost her this position, the loneliness of being new in a town where everyone else had history, it all pressed down on her. A knock on the door startled her. She covered herself quickly and opened the door to find Caleb standing there, hat in hands, looking uncomfortable. "Caleb, I didn't expect. Come in." He stepped into the tiny room, seeming even larger in the confined space. "Came to town for supplies. Thought I'd check how your first week went." "It went well. Mostly." Clara gestured to the only chair, but Caleb remained standing. "The younger children are wonderful. The older boys are testing me." "Marcus Tolliver. How did you know?" "Jim's been telling everyone in town that you're unfit to teach his precious son." Caleb's jaw was tight. "Hoping to turn opinion against you." Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly tired beyond words. "Will it work?" "No. Most folks are just grateful their children have a teacher again, and the ones who've talked to their kids have heard good things." He paused. "But you should know, Jim's not going to let this go. He wanted someone else for this position, someone he could control." "Who?" "His niece, girl from back east with teaching credentials. She was supposed to arrive last month, but her family changed their minds about frontier life." Caleb's expression was grim. "Jim thinks if he makes enough trouble for you, the board will hold the position open until his niece agrees to come. So I'm in his way." "You're in his way, and he hates that someone he doesn't control is working in his town." Caleb finally moved to the chair, sitting carefully like he was afraid it might break under his weight. "But you've got allies too. Frank Morrison, me. Parents whose children are actually learning. Just keep your head down and do good work." Clara looked at Samuel, dozing peacefully after his feeding. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. Today I had to teach fractions while nursing him under a shawl because he wouldn't stop crying. Half the class couldn't concentrate, and Marcus made a comment that made the other boys laugh." "What did you do?" "Ignored him. Finished the lesson." "But Caleb, what happens when Samuel gets older and needs more attention? What happens when winter comes and this room is so cold I can barely think? What happens when—" Her voice broke. "What if I'm not strong enough for this?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "You stood in a storm with a dying baby and didn't quit. You learned to ride in 3 days. You faced down a classroom of frontier children who've broken stronger teachers than you. You're strong enough, Clara. You just have to believe it." "I'm scared." "Good. Fear keeps you careful." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But don't let it make you small. You earned this position. You're doing good work. Don't let Jim Tolliver or anyone else convince you otherwise." Clara wiped her eyes quickly. "Thank you for coming. I needed to hear that. I'll come by every week or so. Bring supplies if you need them. And if you ever want to bring Samuel out to the ranch on weekends, you're welcome. Might do you both good to get out of town." After Caleb left, Clara stood at her small window watching the town settle into evening. Lamplight glowed in windows, smoke rose from chimneys, families gathered for supper in homes she'd never enter. She was separate from all of it, alone in her tiny room above the mercantile. But maybe that was all right. Maybe being separate meant being free. The next weeks fell into rhythm. Clara taught 5 days a week, improving with practice. She learned which students needed extra help, which responded to praise, which required firm boundaries. She developed a rotating schedule that kept the mixed ages engaged. While the older students worked problems independently, she'd gather the younger ones for reading. Then she'd switch, giving the little ones quiet work, while she challenged the older students with more complex material. Samuel became a fixture in the classroom. The younger children adored him, and Clara sometimes let the older girls hold him during lunch break as a reward for good behavior. Even some of the boys softened toward the baby, though they'd never admit it. But Marcus Tolliver remained a constant thorn. He wasn't violent or openly defiant. That would have given Clara grounds to expel him. Instead, he was subtly disruptive, dropping his slate at crucial moments, asking questions designed to waste time, making faces behind Clara's back that set the other students giggling. 3 weeks into the term, Clara kept him after class. "Marcus, sit down. We need to talk." He slouched into a chair, arms crossed. "What? Why do you hate me?" The direct question caught him off guard. "I don't." "Yes, you do. And I want to know why." Clara sat on the edge of her desk, Samuel asleep in his basket beside her. "I haven't done anything to you personally, so why the constant disruption?" Marcus's jaw worked. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then words burst out. "My pa says you're a liar. Says you're not really a widow, that you probably ran away from your husband and made up some story. Says women like you are—" He stopped, his face reddening. "Women like me are what?" "Nothing. Forget it." Clara took a careful breath, keeping her voice calm. "Your father is wrong about me. My husband did die, and I am raising my son alone. But even if your father was right, even if I was a liar, that has nothing to do with whether I can teach you mathematics and literature, does it?" Marcus looked away, uncomfortable. "I don't know what you want from me," Clara continued, "but I know what I want from you. I want you to learn. I want you to leave this classroom better educated than when you entered. Everything else, your father's opinions, my personal life, whether you like me, none of that matters as much as whether you can read, write, and think clearly. Can you do that? Can you set aside the rest and just learn?" Silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus shrugged, still not meeting her eyes. "I guess." "Then that's what we'll do. You focus on learning, I'll focus on teaching. Deal?" Another shrug. "Sure." It wasn't a victory, not really. But when Marcus returned Monday, he was fractionally less disruptive. He still didn't participate enthusiastically, but he stopped actively sabotaging lessons. It was enough. October arrived with the first real cold. Clara woke one morning to frost on her window and realized with a sick feeling that winter was coming and she was completely unprepared. Her tiny stove barely heated the small room, and she had only 2 blankets for herself and Samuel. The walk to school would be brutal in snow, and the schoolhouse stove, while larger, consumed wood at an alarming rate. She was worrying over finances that evening when another knock came. This time it was a woman Clara recognized from church, Martha Hayes, the minister's wife. "Mrs. Whitman, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, please, come in." Martha entered carrying a large basket. "Some of us ladies thought you might need a few things for winter. Nothing fancy, just practical items." She began unpacking 2 thick quilts, a warm shawl, knitted socks, a tin of rendered fat for the stove, candles, and at the bottom, a beautiful hand-sewn baby blanket. Clara's throat closed up. "Mrs. Hayes, this is too much nonsense. We take care of our own in Ridgeway, and like it or not, you're one of us now." Martha's smile was warm. "My daughter Lucy is in your class. She comes home every day chattering about what she learned. That's worth more than a few quilts." After Martha left, Clara sat surrounded by the gifts and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The town was watching her, yes, but some of them were watching with kindness. The next Sunday after church, 3 more women approached her. Sarah Webb brought preserves. Elizabeth Morrison offered to watch Samuel occasionally if Clara needed help. Even stern Mrs. Kowalski smiled and said her Emma was reading better than she ever had. But not everyone was warming to her. Jim Tolliver made a point of cutting her directly whenever their paths crossed. His wife followed his lead, gathering her skirts as though Clara carried disease. And she sometimes caught other women whispering, their eyes sharp with speculation. The schoolhouse politics were complicated too. Clara had to navigate not just the students, but their parents, each with their own expectations and prejudices. The ranchers wanted practical education, arithmetic for business, reading for contracts. The minister wanted moral instruction. The lawyer wanted classical education for his daughters. And everyone had opinions about how she should manage her classroom and her child. One afternoon in late October, Clara was teaching history when Samuel started crying, not his usual fussy cry, but a sharp wail of distress. She picked him up and felt his forehead blazing with fever. "Class dismissed early today," she said, trying to keep panic from her voice. "Older students, make sure the younger ones get home safely. Marcus, bank the stove before you leave." She was out the door before Marcus could respond, Samuel screaming against her chest. By the time she reached her room, he was burning up and barely responsive. Clara laid him on the bed and tried to nurse him, but he wouldn't latch. His breathing was fast and shallow, and his eyes had a glazed look that terrified her. She ran downstairs to the mercantile. Mr. Morrison, I need the doctor. My son is sick. Morrison took one look at her face and nodded. Doc Henderson's at the Simmons place. I'll send my boy to fetch him. You get back upstairs and keep the baby cool. Clara ran back up, stripped Samuel to his diaper, and bathed him with cool water. He cried weakly, and she could feel her own panic rising. Not this. Not after everything. She couldn't lose him now. The doctor arrived within an hour, a gruff older man who examined Samuel with brisk efficiency while Clara hovered, wringing her hands. It's croup, he finally announced. Common enough in babies his age, especially with the weather turning. The fever's concerning but not critical yet. What do I do? Keep him cool. Keep trying to get fluids in him. Steam helps. Boil water on the stove. Let him breathe the vapor. And watch him close tonight. If the breathing gets worse or the fever spikes higher, send for me immediately. Henderson packed his bag. Most babies come through croup just fine, Mrs. Whitman. Try not to worry too much. But worry was all Clara could do. She sat up all night with Samuel, bathing him when the fever spiked, holding him over steam when his breathing went rough and raspy. She prayed despite herself, bargaining with the deity she'd stopped believing in after Thomas left. Just let him live. Please, just let him live. Sometime near dawn, she heard footsteps on the stairs. The door opened without a knock, and Caleb entered carrying blankets and a jar of something dark. Morrison sent word to the ranch, he said quietly. How is he? The doctor says croup. He's been feverish all night. Clara's voice was hoarse from crying and exhaustion. Caleb set down his burdens and felt Samuel's forehead with a gentle hand. Fever's broke some. That's good. He opened the jar, willow bark tea. My wife used this when she was sick. Helps with fever and pain. Can you get a few drops in him? Together they managed to get Samuel to swallow some of the bitter tea. Within an hour, the fever dropped noticeably. By sunrise, Samuel was breathing easier and finally sleeping peacefully. Clara sagged against Caleb's shoulder, too tired to be embarrassed. Thank you. I didn't know what to do. You did fine. You kept him alive through the worst of it. Caleb's voice was rough. But you can't do this alone, Clara. You need help. I don't have anyone. You have me. He said it simply, like it was obvious. And you have people in this town who care whether you make it or not. Stop being too proud to ask for help when you need it. Clara looked up at him, this hard man who kept showing unexpected gentleness. Why do you keep helping me? Because someone should. The same answer he'd given before. But this time Clara understood it differently. Not obligation or duty, but choice. Caleb Hart had decided she was worth helping, and nothing would change his mind. Samuel recovered over the next few days, and Clara returned to teaching with new understanding. She couldn't do this completely alone. She needed the community, even if they didn't fully trust her yet. So she started accepting help when offered, letting Sarah Webb bring soup when she was tired, allowing Elizabeth Morrison to watch Samuel during parent meetings, accepting Martha Hayes' invitation to Sunday supper. Slowly, carefully, Clara built a place for herself in Ridgeway. Not as Thomas's widow, most people had forgotten to ask about her dead husband, but as Mrs. Whitman, the teacher, the woman raising a baby alone and doing a decent job of both. By mid-November, even Marcus Tolliver had settled into grudging acceptance. He'd never like her, but he'd stopped actively fighting. And one day Clara looked up from helping Emma with her letters to see Marcus explaining a mathematics concept to younger Johnny Webb with unexpected patience. It was a small moment, easily missed, but Clara saw it and felt something shift. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was teaching, really teaching, making a difference in these children's lives. That evening, she wrote her first letter to Caleb since moving to town, though she'd see him in a few days anyway. She wrote about Marcus's kindness to Johnny, about Emma reading her first full book, about the way the mountains looked when frost touched them in morning light. She wrote about Samuel's first tooth coming in and how he'd started reaching for her face with deliberate intent. Small things, daily things, the texture of a life being built one day at a time. She didn't write about the loneliness or the fear or the night she still woke gasping from dreams of storms and abandonment. Those were private truths carried alone. But as she sealed the letter and looked around her small room, warm now with the quilts Martha had brought, homey with the few possessions she'd gathered, Clara thought maybe alone wasn't the same as abandoned. Maybe alone could also mean independent, strong, capable of building something that belonged entirely to her. Outside, the first snow began to fall, soft and silent against the window. Winter was coming, and Clara was ready for it. Winter came to Montana with teeth bared. By December, snow lay 3 feet deep in places, and the morning walk to the schoolhouse left Clara's face numb and her fingers aching despite the thick mittens Martha Hayes had knitted. But she made the walk every day, Samuel bundled against her chest in layers of wool, because this was her life now, and she wouldn't let weather take it from her. The schoolhouse was her kingdom through those dark months. Outside, the world contracted to white silence and brutal cold. Inside, 20 children crowded around the pot-bellied stove and learned their lessons while wind rattled the windows. Clara taught them reading and arithmetic, but she also taught them perseverance, showing up every day despite hardship, doing good work despite difficulty, building something worthwhile from whatever materials you had. They learned. Even Marcus Tolliver, who'd finally stopped fighting her and started paying attention. He had a sharp mind when he chose to use it, and Clara found herself giving him harder problems, challenging him beyond the standard curriculum. He complained but did the work, and sometimes she caught him almost smiling when he solved something particularly difficult. Caleb came to town every 2 weeks through the winter, bringing supplies and checking on her with his quiet, unobtrusive care. He'd arrive at the schoolhouse as classes ended, help her bank the stove and carry Samuel home, then disappear back to his ranch before anyone could make assumptions. But people talked anyway, because people always talked. "Seems odd," Clara overheard Mrs. Sutton say to another woman at the mercantile. "A man coming all this way just to check on a woman who's nothing to him." "Maybe she's not nothing to him," the other woman replied archly. "Maybe that baby's father is closer than Fort Laramie." Clara had stood in the next aisle, frozen with Samuel in her arms, feeling rage and shame war in her chest. She wanted to confront them, defend herself and Caleb both, but she'd learned that silence often served better than explanation. Let them speculate. She knew the truth, and so did Caleb. That had to be enough. But the rumors wore on her. They wore on Caleb too, though he never said so directly. She could see it in the set of his jaw when he came to town, in the way he kept their interactions brief and public. He was protecting her reputation even as it cost him. One February evening, Clara was preparing lessons when someone pounded on her door with unusual urgency. She opened it to find Frank Morrison, his face grim. "Mrs. Whitman, we need to talk. May I come in?" Clara's stomach dropped, but she stepped aside. Morrison entered, removing his hat and twisting it in his hands. "There's been complaints," he said without preamble, "about your moral character. Let me guess. Jim Tolliver. Him and others. They're saying your relationship with Caleb Hart is inappropriate, that you're setting a bad example for the children." Morrison's expression was pained. "I don't believe the rumors, Mrs. Whitman, but I have to take community concerns seriously." Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the school board is meeting tomorrow night to discuss your position. Jim's demanding your dismissal. He's got 3 other board members wavering." 3 out of 5? "Including me makes 4 who might keep you, but Reverend Hayes is concerned about appearances and Webb tends to follow Jim's lead." Morrison met her eyes directly. "I'm telling you this so you're not blindsided, and because you deserve a chance to defend yourself." After he left, Clara sat in the dark with Samuel asleep beside her and felt the familiar terror of abandonment creep back in. She'd built a life here. She'd earned her place through hard work and dedication. And now Jim Tolliver was going to take it away with lies and innuendo. She could run, pack up in the night and leave before the board meeting, avoid the humiliation of being fired. But running meant starting over somewhere else with even less than she'd had before, and it meant letting Jim Tolliver win. Clara looked at Samuel's sleeping face and made her decision. She wouldn't run. She'd fight. The next morning, she taught her regular classes with fierce focus, When school ended, she asked the older students to stay behind. "I need your help," she said directly. "There are people who want me removed as your teacher. They're making accusations that aren't true. Tomorrow night, the school board will decide whether I keep this position." The students exchanged glances. Marcus spoke first. "What kind of accusations?" "That my friendship with Mr. Hart is inappropriate, that I'm not a fit moral example for you." Clara kept her voice steady. "I can defend myself, but it would help if the board heard from students. If they knew whether you're actually learning anything, whether I've been a good teacher. I can't ask you to speak for me, that's not fair. But if any of you wanted to attend that meeting and share your honest opinions, it might make a difference." Silence. Then Emma Kowalski stood up, all fierce determination despite her small size. "I'm coming. You're the best teacher we ever had. Everyone knows it." "Me too," said Robert Webb. "My pa needs to hear the truth." One by one, the other students volunteered. Even Marcus, after a long pause, nodded curtly. "I'll be there." The school board met in the back room of Morrison's Mercantile. Clara arrived early with Samuel, her heart hammering but her face composed. The 5 board members sat at a long table: Morrison, Webb, Sutton, Reverend Hayes, and Kowalski. Jim Tolliver sat in the front row of chairs, his satisfaction barely concealed. What Jim didn't expect was the crowd. Clara's students had come, along with their parents. Martha Hayes sat prominently in the second row. Sarah Webb had brought her husband. Even Elizabeth Morrison was there, though her presence was probably required as Frank's wife. Frank Morrison called the meeting to order, his expression neutral. "We're here to discuss concerns about Mrs. Whitman's position as school teacher. Jim, you wanted to speak first?" Jim stood, smoothing his vest. "Thank you, Frank. I'll be direct. Mrs. Whitman has been carrying on an inappropriate relationship with Caleb Hart, a single woman entertaining a single man regularly in her rooms above the Mercantile. It's scandalous, and it sets a terrible example for our children. Mr. Hart brings me supplies and checks on my welfare," Clara said calmly. "He saved my life and my son's life. His friendship has been entirely proper." "Proper?" Jim's voice dripped scorn. "A man doesn't visit a woman weekly out of friendship. And there's questions about that baby, too. Convenient that your husband died right when you showed up here. Convenient that Caleb Hart was so eager to help you." Clara felt her face flush but kept her voice level. "My husband died at Fort Laramie. The telegram confirmed it, and Mr. Hart helped me because I was dying in a storm. If you find that suspicious, perhaps you should examine your own character, not his." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Jim's face reddened. "I'm not on trial here." "Neither am I," Clara interrupted. "Or I shouldn't be. I've taught these children well. My personal life is irrelevant." "Your morals are absolutely relevant," Jim shot back. "We won't have a woman of questionable virtue teaching our children." "Then let's ask them." Clara turned to face the room. "Let's ask the children what they've learned. Whether I've been a good teacher. Whether my personal life has interfered with their education." Emma Kowalski stood up before anyone could object. "Mrs. Whitman taught me to read. Real reading, not just sounding out words. I can read whole books now because of her." Robert Webb stood next. "She's fair. Even when Marcus was being awful, she gave him chances to do better." One by one, students stood and spoke. About lessons that made sense, about feeling challenged, about actually wanting to come to school. Even the parents began adding their voices, children who came home excited about learning, grades improving, behavioral problems diminishing. Then Marcus Tolliver stood. The room went silent. "My pa thinks Mrs. Whitman is a bad teacher," Marcus said slowly. "But my pa is wrong." He looked at his father, whose face had gone purple. "She's hard on us, but fair. She makes us think instead of just memorizing, and she treats us like we're capable of more than we think we are. That's good teaching." But Jim Tolliver exploded. "Boy, sit down!" "Let him speak," Morrison interrupted firmly. "He's a student. He has a right to share his experience," Marcus continued, his voice stronger now. "And about Mr. Hart. I seen them together. Nothing improper ever happened. He brings supplies and leaves. That's it. Anyone saying different is lying." "You calling me a liar?" Jim was half out of his seat. "I'm saying you're wrong." Marcus met his father's glare without flinching. "Mrs. Whitman's a good teacher. We should keep her." The crowd erupted in agreement. Jim tried to shout over them, but Morrison banged his gavel. "Order! This board will make its decision in private. Everyone else, clear the room." Clara waited outside with Samuel while the board deliberated. The students clustered around her, their parents offering encouraging words. Even Marcus stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Thank you," Clara told him quietly. That took courage. Marcus shrugged, but she saw the flush of pride on his face. Was the truth. Figure that matters. After 30 agonizing minutes, Morrison opened the door. "Mrs. Whitman, please come in." Clara entered the room, her legs shaking. The 5 board members sat stone-faced. Jim Tolliver was nowhere to be seen. Morrison spoke. "We've discussed the accusations thoroughly. The vote was 4-1 in your favor. Your position is secure." Clara's knees nearly gave out. "Thank you. However," Reverend Hayes added, "we do ask that you be mindful of appearances going forward. Perhaps limit Mr. Hart's visits to daylight hours. Ensure there's always someone else present." It was unfair, Clara thought, punishing her for gossip rather than truth. But she nodded, knowing when to accept a compromise. Outside, the students cheered when she emerged. Samuel, startled by the noise, began crying, and Clara laughed despite herself, a slightly hysterical sound of relief and exhaustion and victory. That night she wrote to Caleb explaining what had happened. She wrote about Marcus's courage, about the students defending her, about the vote that had saved her position. But she also wrote about the restrictions, the need to be more careful about appearances. "I hate that we have to pretend there's something wrong with friendship," she wrote. "I hate that kindness gets twisted into scandal. But I understand why you've been careful, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you for protecting my reputation even when it cost you." Caleb's response came a week later, delivered by a ranch hand passing through town. The letter was brief, in his rough handwriting. "Don't apologize for other people's small minds. You did nothing wrong. Neither did I. If they want to make my visits less frequent, so be it. But I won't stop checking on you entirely. Some things matter more than appearances." Spring came slowly to Montana, the snow retreating grudgingly through March and April. Clara watched the world thaw and felt something thaw inside herself, too. She'd survived her first winter in Ridgeway, survived Jim Tolliver's attacks, survived loneliness and hardship and the constant pressure of proving herself worthy. Samuel was 9 months old now, crawling and babbling and trying to pull himself up on furniture. The students had grown too, not just in knowledge, but in confidence. Even Marcus had softened, sometimes staying after class to ask Clara's opinion on books or discuss ideas that went beyond the curriculum. One warm April afternoon, Clara was walking home from school when she encountered Caleb on the street. They'd seen each other only 3 times since February, always in public, always with other people around. But now the street was empty, and they stood facing each other in the spring sunlight. "Clara." Caleb looked older somehow, wearier. "How are you?" "I'm well. You?" "Managing." He glanced around, checking for watchers. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About the situation. About how we're letting other people's opinions dictate how we live." He met her eyes directly. "It's not right." Clara's heart began to pound. "Caleb, I'm not saying anything improper, but I am saying that I value your friendship, value you, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise to satisfy people like Jim Tolliver." "What are you suggesting?" Caleb took a breath. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to stop caring what they think. Maybe it's time to make our own choices about how this works." Clara looked at this man who'd saved her life, who'd given her space to become strong, who'd never asked for anything in return except the chance to help. She thought about the life she'd built, hard-won and precious. She thought about Samuel, who deserved more than a mother constantly worried about appearances. "I choose honesty," she said quietly. "I choose friendship without shame, and I choose to stop apologizing for either." Caleb's expression softened. "Good." They stood there for another moment, not touching, not doing anything that would give the gossips ammunition. But something had shifted between them, a decision made, a line drawn. That Sunday, Clara accepted Martha Hayes's invitation to supper. The minister's house was warm and full of life, children running about, good food, easy laughter. Over dessert, Martha leaned close. "I've been watching you, Clara, how you've handled everything this year. You remind me of myself when I first came west, determined to make it work despite everything. Did you face rumors too? Oh, honey, everyone faces rumors. The question is whether you let them define you. Martha smiled. You haven't. You've defined yourself. That takes strength. I had help, good people who believed in me, and you earned that belief. That matters. Martha paused. Caleb Hart's a good man. Lonely, but good. If there's something developing there, there isn't, Claire said quickly. We're friends, that's all. Martha's look was knowing but not unkind. All right. But if that changes, you should know that some of us wouldn't think poorly of it. Sometimes the frontier gives us second chances we didn't expect. The school year ended in May with a small ceremony. Parents filled the schoolhouse to watch their children recite poetry and demonstrate their learning. Clara stood at the front, Samuel on her hip, and felt pride swell in her chest. These children had learned. They'd grown. She'd done that. Frank Morrison presented her with a contract for the next year, $35 monthly, a raise based on her performance. Clara signed it without hesitation, her hand steady. After the ceremony, parents lingered to thank her. Sarah Webb brought preserves. Elizabeth Morrison offered to help with Samuel over the summer. Even Robert Webb Sr., who'd voted against her in February, shook her hand and admitted his son had never been more engaged in school. Marcus was the last to leave. He stood awkwardly by the door, clearly wanting to say something. You heading back to your father's ranch for summer? Clara asked. Yeah, but I wanted to say... He stopped, started again. I learned a lot this year, not just school stuff, about being decent, I guess. About standing up even when it's hard. So, thanks. Clara's throat tightened. You did that yourself, Marcus. I just gave you the space to figure it out. After he left, Clara sat in the empty schoolhouse with Samuel and let herself feel everything. The fear of last September, standing in the storm. The desperation of those first weeks in town. The terror when Samuel got sick. The anger when Jim Tolliver tried to destroy her. And now this. Accomplishment, security, respect earned through honest work. She wasn't the woman who'd married Thomas Whitman. That woman had believed in rescue and protection and being taken care of. This woman, the one who'd survived storms and abandonment and frontier hardship, believed in herself. Caleb came to town the next week to pick her up. The school board had agreed she could spend summers at his ranch helping with work in exchange for room and board. It was practical. She'd save money, Samuel would have space to play, and she'd learn ranching skills that might prove useful. The board had approved it because Caleb made it clear she'd be working, earning her keep, nothing more. The truth was more complicated, but Clara had stopped worrying about that. She knew who she was and what she wanted. Everything else would sort itself out. The ranch looked different in spring, grass greening the hills, wildflowers dotting the meadows, the mountains still snow-capped but softening. Clara breathed in the clean air and felt something settle in her chest. This place had saved her life. Now it would help her build the next part of it. That summer, Clara learned to garden and preserve food. She learned to milk cows and separate cream. She learned which fence posts needed replacing and how to check horses for injury. Caleb taught her everything with patient thoroughness, treating her like a capable partner rather than a delicate woman who needed protecting. Samuel learned to walk on the ranch, taking his first wobbly steps between the garden rows while Clara weeded beans. She caught him mid-tumble and lifted him up, laughing at his delighted shriek. Caleb watched from the barn door, something soft in his expression that made Clara's heart skip. They didn't talk about it. They worked side by side through long summer days, ate simple suppers at the kitchen table, sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Sometimes their hands would brush reaching for the same tool, or their eyes would meet across Samuel's sleeping form, and something unspoken would pass between them. But neither pushed it into words. One evening in July, Clara was washing dishes when Caleb came in from checking the animals. He stood in the doorway, hat in hands, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen. Clara, I need to say something. Her hand stilled in the dishwater. All right. I know we've kept things careful, kept it proper, and that's been right. You needed space to become your own person, not just someone rescued by a man. He moved closer, his voice rough. But I'm tired of pretending I don't care about you. I do. More than I should, maybe. More than I plan to. Clara turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Caleb, I'm not asking for anything," he continued. "You've built a good life. You're independent now, capable. You don't need me. But I wanted you to know, if you ever wanted more than friendship, if you ever thought about building something together, I'd be honored." Clara looked at this man who'd saved her life, who'd given her space to grow strong, who'd never asked for gratitude or affection or anything except the chance to help. She thought about the woman she'd been, desperate, abandoned, broken. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong, independent, capable of standing alone. And she realized that choosing love from strength was completely different from accepting it from desperation. "I don't need you," she said slowly, and saw him flinch. "But I choose you anyway. That's different. Better." Caleb's expression transformed. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Clara stepped closer. "I choose honesty over appearances. I choose partnership over propriety. I choose you, Caleb Hart, because you're worth choosing." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious. Samuel made a sound from his blanket nest, and they broke apart laughing, the moment both profound and perfectly ordinary. They married in September, a year after the storm that had changed everything. The ceremony was small, just a few close friends and Clara's students at the Ridgeway Church. Martha Hayes cried. Frank Morrison gave Clara away. Even Marcus Tolliver attended, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes, but genuinely pleased. Jim Tolliver didn't come, of course, but his absence bothered Clara less than she'd expected. He'd tried to destroy her and failed. She'd built something he couldn't touch, a life earned through her own strength, a love chosen freely, a future that belonged entirely to her. The school board had no objections to her marriage. She'd proven herself capable of managing both teaching and family. And Caleb made it clear Clara's work was her own. He supported her teaching, would never ask her to give it up, valued her independence as much as her partnership. They settled into a rhythm, Clara teaching in town during the week, returning to the ranch on weekends. It wasn't traditional, but nothing about their relationship was traditional. They'd built it from storm and abandonment and hard-won trust. They'd built it strong. 2 years later, Clara stood in the schoolhouse on the last day of term, her students reciting the poems they'd written about frontier life. Samuel, now 3 years old, sat in the back row watching his mother work. Her second child, a daughter they'd named Sarah, after Caleb's first wife, slept in a basket by the stove. Marcus Tolliver had gone east to university, his sharp mind finally getting the education it deserved. He wrote Clara letters about his studies, about the world beyond Montana, always signing them, "Your grateful student." Emma Kowalski was reading at a 6th grade level despite being only 8. Robert Webb was helping Clara teach arithmetic to the younger children. After the students left, Clara stood at the window looking out at the mountains. 4 years ago, she'd been abandoned in a storm with nothing but a baby and dying hope. Now she had a family, a profession, a community that respected her. She had students who learned because she taught them well. She had a husband who valued her strength as much as her softness. The broken wagon wheel hung by their gate at the ranch. Caleb had found it that first summer and mounted it there deliberately. Not as a memorial to loss, but as a reminder that sometimes breaking is the beginning of something better. Sometimes abandonment leads to freedom. Sometimes the worst storms bring you exactly where you need to be. Clara gathered her things, settled Sarah in her sling, took Samuel's small hand, and headed home. Not to the tiny room above the mercantile where she'd learned to stand alone, but to the ranch where she'd learned that choosing partnership didn't diminish independence, it multiplied it. That evening, she and Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, their children asleep inside, the summer air warm and full of promise. Clara thought about the woman she'd been, standing in mud and rain, watching lanterns disappear into darkness. That woman wouldn't recognize this life, this peace, this strength, this joy. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, his hand warm around hers. "About storms," Clara said, "and how sometimes they bring you home." He squeezed her hand, understanding without need for explanation. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the mountains fading to silhouettes against the stars. Inside the house, Sarah began to fuss, and Clara rose to tend her, Caleb following close behind. This was her life now, built from nothing, earned through everything, chosen with full knowledge of its cost and value. Not the life she'd imagined when she'd headed west with Thomas, not the life anyone would have predicted for the abandoned woman in the storm, but it was hers, completely, honestly, irrevocably hers. And that made all the difference. The wagon wheel stayed by the gate for years, weathering into gray wood but never breaking further. Visitors sometimes asked about it, and Clara would tell them the truth, that it marked the place where her old life ended and her real life began, where she stopped being someone who needed saving and became someone who saved herself. And on stormy nights, when rain hammered the roof and wind rattled the windows, Clara would hold her children close and remember. Remember the terror and the darkness and the moment when everything seemed lost. Remember Caleb riding through the rain because someone had to. Remember choosing to fight instead of surrender, to build instead of break, to love again when love had betrayed her. The storms always passed. The sun always returned. And Clara Whitman Hart, teacher and rancher and mother and wife, would rise each morning to meet whatever came next. Not rescued, not saved, not protected from life's hardships, but strong enough to face them. And that was everything.